So welcome everybody to our panel discussion on competency as a culture. This is our keynote session for Fire Buyer Live for this issue. My name's Rebecca Spayne, I'm the managing editor here at International Fire Buyer, and I'm also heading up the conference agenda for Fire Buyer Live. I'm joined here with four very influential people in the industry who will all demonstrate their perspective on competence. I'm joined by Steve Ham, the CEO of Institution of Fire Engineers, Jacob Derrick, the director of COEAS Technical, who is also a fire engineer and consultant, Kevin Day, lecturer of fire risk engineering at Glasgow Caledonian University, and Carrie Good, who is a building control surveyor at Stroma. This panel discussion will aim to cover three key areas of learning that all come under the bracket of competence as culture. We will be looking at what is competence and what is not, why is competence important, and how can we identify competent individuals and organisations. So competency has certainly become a buzzword in the industry and a theme that has taken centre stage at Fire Buyer Live. We come to you first, Steve, as the Institution of Fire Engineers has a direct role to play as a professional guidance body. So what do you think the difference between professional memberships and professional registrations is, and what are their limitations?
Yeah, okay, thanks. And this, I think, is a really good and logical starting point to this session. Let's get ourselves in the same page as by what we mean by these terms around competence, professionalism, membership of a body, registration. What do those things mean? So I'll try and iron those out and get some sort of common understanding of what we mean by these terms. So the essential components, really, if we look at membership of a professional body, and the Institution of Fire Engineers is one of a number of professional engineering institutions that apply common standards overseen and mandated through the Engineering Council across the entire engineering industry. So when it comes to fire engineering, we're not doing this alone. We're using a sort of common benchmark to define these things. So first of all, let's just think about what it means to be a member of a professional body. What's the criteria that is looked for, and what does it actually mean? So there are two things, really, in criteria. The first one is evidence of knowledge and understanding. Now, that's normally a qualification, but there are other means of that the individuals can demonstrate that. And that's coupled with a second component, which is periods of experience in the industry. And that's the sort of entry level into a professional body. So it's a combination of demonstrable knowledge and understanding and relevant experience. Now that gives membership. What's professional registration all about is essentially, we can think about this of taking it a step further. So what we do with professional registration is actually start looking at people's competence. So I think the easiest way of looking at this is if somebody is registered, then that means that the professional body has looked at an individual's work in detail and as a test into their competence, and then registering in the IFE, we register people on behalf of the Engineering Council. We're licensed by them to do that. Now that's distinct from membership. So membership demonstrates, and it's very valuable demonstration, that people have knowledge, understanding and relevant experience. But registration, I think the key difference is that we're also measuring and examining competence and assessing that against a benchmark standard. So why is that important? Well, if we understand that distinction, then I think it enables more informed decisions to be taken when, for example, commissioning decisions or contracting decisions are made about the level of assurance that is required, really, from third parties when dealing with people in the fire engineering profession. So hopefully that sort of helped to level the ground, really, in terms of our collective understanding about what we mean by these terms.
Thank you. And Carrie, as somebody who spends every day closely working with organisations and developers to meet these building regulations and compliance standards, what do you think is the biggest challenge currently when it comes to competence and the responsible party?
So I think the biggest challenge that I know I face is working out where the levels of competency need to lie. So obviously there's a lot of focus in the media at the moment about bringing up the competency levels in building control, for example. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't the same sort of thing being applied to architects, like general contractors on site, people who specify, and also the material manufacturers themselves. So obviously, Steve mentioned, obviously you've got your fire engineers, they all go through the accreditation process, but who's checking the people who do the initial work? So we're doing very good at catching up at the third parties and the people who sign it off, but I think we need to drill more focus down onto the first party, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure if the industry is looking that way. I think that should be like a first port of call. That should be something we should definitely be looking at.
So definitely a collaborative approach then. And similarly, Kevin, as a lecturer for fire risk engineering, you must also have quite a strong opinion on what you deem to be the biggest challenge.
I believe one of the biggest challenges is that we have to develop a clear framework, as Carrie said, for all elements throughout the life cycle of the building, from the design phase all the way through to the whole life of the building. If we don't have that and we're not checking that regularly, it can slip. You know, the people at the top who are the engineers that are registered with the Engineering Council, etc., they have the benefit of the degree programs and the paid for continual professional development. Unless we develop a proper framework for the whole of the construction industry moving forward, I think we'll struggle to prove we're remaining competent.
And do you think any of this will be addressed in the gateway process?
I can jump into that a little bit. So yeah. I think with the gateway processes, they're trying to bring it down to like the beginning stages. So for example, gateway 1 is planning. So then the building safety regulator will assess everything at that stage before they even think about putting it onto site. And then obviously gateway 2 is a hard stop between the planning stage and when they're starting to actually figure out the full design. So I think that's how they're sort of planning to get through that. But obviously we've still got the missing elements in between that we spoke about earlier. So it's all very well and good having the checker qualified and competent, but we need to have the competence throughout the entire process.
And particularly since the Grenfell tragedy, competency and responsibility has become quite a legislative focus. Jacob, having had just under 20 years experience in fire safety and having worked across a wide breadth of the industry sectors at all stages of design, construction, operation, why do you think that it is only now that competency has become such a core focus?
Simply put, I think the Grenfell tragedy showed the very human cost of when competence goes quite badly wrong. It brought that into very real focus that not just people in industry could understand, but the wider public at large as well. I think there were a lot of assumptions in the UK construction industry, and that probably wasn't helped by elongated contract chains, passing on liability downstream to smaller and smaller contractors. I think all of that led to a dilution of oversight by the people that were ultimately delivering a product, which was the building. I think that siloed thinking as well, where you have people that go to do a job and they go and do their job. There's no, there wasn't necessarily any concern or thinking for the impact of their particular job on someone else. So you just had lots of people going and, putting their peg in their hole and walking away. And there wasn't really too much consideration of, well, hang on a minute, how does one thing affect another? I think one of the other things, unfortunately, is money. It's price. The UK construction industry, and perhaps across the world, I'm only au fait with the UK. There has been a kind of race to the bottom to try and reduce costs through contract chains, and unfortunately, I think for companies that have made effort to show competence, that comes at a cost. That costs companies in training, in CPD, and registrations. All of the things that we're saying right now people need, it does cost. And so when we get to the construction phase and someone's making a decision or procuring, heavily biased towards price, the company that's best placed to provide a competent individual is not necessarily the cheapest company, and therefore the competent individuals aren't necessarily the ones that get appointed to do the work.
So definitely a case of communication and transparency. Steve, Kevin, Carrie, have you guys got anything to add on the significance of competency?
I could build on what Jacob said a little bit. I mean, Jacob quite rightly has mentioned the the issues around sort of what I would call direct competence, people understanding what they're doing, and this sort of integration of activity. I absolutely, support everything that's been said there. I think there's another layer to this as well that the Grenfell, particularly phase 2 inquiry outcomes, will highlight, and we've seen it in the inquiry process. Phase 1 was all about what happened on the night, and the phase 2 now is, well, why did it happen? And there is question marks over competency. Of course there is, and that's just been examined in detail there with Jacob. There's also the aspect of behaviours, and we talk about competence, and really what I think we want to focus on is professional conduct and professional standards. And to me, the definition of a professional in this context, in an engineering context, is, again, this is not just unique to fire, this applies to all engineering disciplines, is captured again through Engineering Council, in so much as to become registered, we're not just looking for evidence of knowledge, understanding and practice and competence in practice. We're also looking for demonstrable evidence of behaviours and ethics and values. And those two together, A and B equals C, and that's what makes somebody competent. It's not solely the knowledge, understanding and practice. Of course that's important, but you can be very, very competent at doing the wrong thing. So let's make sure that people are doing the right thing, and that's where these additional sort of checks and balances come in through professional registration. So I think that really illustrates the benefit of professional registration when people are being sort of appointed to as contractors, etc. And a final point, Jacob's absolutely right. The margins in contracting in the UK are negligible, and competence does come at a cost. Professional registration comes at a cost. What I would say, from an IFE perspective, being an international body, that is not true elsewhere in the world. There's a culture in the UK, I think, which we could even describe it as a race to the bottom has been described there. It's the margins are so narrow that it's pretty much untrue, but there are examples elsewhere outside the UK, I think, where there are probably more models that we can learn from.
So how can we tackle that cost for competence?
And that is a really important aspect here. Is the majority of the cost of competence is already borne and absorbed. Where we have the gap is demonstrable competence. The vast majority of people out there do know what they're doing, and they do things in the right way, but it's the demonstrable element that is the issue. So the cost of training people, putting people through educational programs, employers' costs of developing people, those costs are sunk now anyway. The additional cost is very, very marginal. It's professional fees. So you're talking about, literally, for a chartered engineer, it's less than £500 a year all in. So the investment has already been made. Becoming professionally registered is the end of a long journey that starts either in university or somewhere else, depending on the sort of level that people are operating. So the cost is not as significant, perhaps, as can be imagined. It's more about attitude and approach to this.
I'm not sure that addresses at the other end of the scale. £500 to a chartered engineer a year is maybe not that considerable a sum, but to somebody who's working lower down the chain, it might be quite a lot of money, and it might not be getting provided by their employer.
But by contrast, engineering technician fees are about £100 a year.
No, I'm fully with it. I do agree we should be registered, but I'm just saying it's maybe it's lost in the contracting as you go down the chain, and then you suddenly come across companies that are possibly maybe one or two people that they don't see a benefit from being a member of a body that they possibly don't see as relevant, because as an engineer, a fire alarm engineer back in the day, I was very focused on the green light. I wanted the green light to come on my panel. I didn't want red lights. I didn't want yellow lights. And I was good at my job. I didn't necessarily understand all the whys about why and what I was doing. Now, I believed I was very good at my job, but I was focused on a completely different thing. And I think it's hard to tell people that they have to be registered and they have to follow all of these things, and at a cost.
to echo that as well, I mean, I can only speak from the building control perspective, but there is very much a race to the bottom in terms of fees. So obviously everyone knows there's a bit of competition between local authority building control and AIs. They both drive each other's costs down, and obviously that then impacts the service that we can be providing. So obviously we're going to be having to soak up the fees for building control surveyors. We're going to have to do level 1, 2, 3 competency tests now. And I think like my company alone's got over 100 technical staff. So if you imagine that fee that we've got to pay out for that, plus also the insurance for the company, that's going to have to reflect in the fees at some point. So is that, you know, again with the race to the bottom, how are we going to be able to provide that level of service with the level of competence if we can't obviously accrue that money back?
It's definitely a challenging topic there, and something that hopefully with industry starting to talk about competence a lot more, and with the government stepping in and everything as well, and a lot of industry bodies like the IFE contributing to help better register a lot of engineers. Hopefully that's something that can come into fruition. So moving on to the next question. So when appointing a fire safety expert, trust is crucial. So the expert must be relied upon to do a thorough job to protect the business, like we've discussed. And it's not just the business, it's also the building and the people within it. And it's not just about fire safety, but life safety. So it's crucial that while new legislation across the sector is finalised, and until these strict definitions of what constitutes competence are refined, the responsible person should take into consideration all that we have spoken about so far. Kevin, as a lecturer, you are best placed to probably answer my next question. How can we improve competence and upskilling the industry from the beginning, starting with the education?
I think firstly on that, we really have to be careful about setting strict definitions to what is competence, because we set a bar and people will rise up to that bar and they won't go beyond it because that's all they need to do. So we have to be quite careful. I also think education, obviously really biased, is very important to what we're trying to do here and what we're trying to achieve. But it should be a beginning. It should absolutely be a beginning of a journey, and whether you're an electrician at college or whether you're a young engineer coming through university, it should be a long-term, lifelong learning journey, not just you go for 4 years. Then the next time we hear from a lot of our graduates is when they're trying to get professional recognition and they want a copy of their dissertation because they don't know what they did with it. It becomes a difficult thing to do. We need to give people the time to study and improve what they're trying to do. We see an awful lot from our students that, yes, they're being supported by their company financially to do the course, but they're not getting the time. They really struggle with a work-life education balance, and I would imagine everybody's in this knows what that feels like, trying to balance different things. From a university, what could we do better? We need to have more links to the industry. We need to have industry advisory groups that are informing us that what we are actually providing is suitable and sufficient, to borrow a phrase, and that it's relevant to where we are now in the industry. So I think that's really important. Our demographic of the students has changed massively since Grenfell happened. It's gone from firefighters and some school leavers and some building control people to now we're actually getting some very competent people coming through our doors at an undergrad level to gain a qualification in fire, and we need more fire engineering education providers in this country, not less. And unfortunately, I see it becoming less in the very near future. So I think we have to remove the fear of failure and the fear that if you put your hand up and say, "Oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right," people don't like to say ask the question or admit that they're wrong. And I think it's that bravado that we have to try and get over, that everything is awesome and I'm great and I can do anything. So people have to have that confidence to put their hand up and say, I don't know.
And just to hover for a second on when you mentioned that lifelong learning, Steve, so after fire engineers become qualified, they must continue to learn and develop themselves, not just for competency, but also to continue and further in their career. And CPD is something that's really crucial to this. So how are institutions like the IFE contributing to improving competency?
Yeah, and that question is interesting in the use of the word qualified. So there's another term so what does that mean? So if we take that to mean, from a professional body point of view, I would say that's the moment that you are professionally registered. Let's use that as that moment in time. Everything upstream of that is or downstream of that will be CPD. Everything upstream is an underused term, but it's very relevant, is IPD, your initial professional development, which goes from your, however you gain the knowledge and understanding, whether it's university courses, whether it's level 3 qualifications, depending on what you do, through to gaining experience and becoming professionally registered. That in my world is qualified. Beyond that, then you're into CPD, continuous professional development, and that goes with the expectations of registration through to code of conduct and things of that nature. Now, facilitation of CPD is a core function, obviously, of a professional body. And interestingly, if we've surveyed our membership, and CPD by a significant margin is the number one top of the list member benefit that people feed back to us, followed by quite a large margin, but followed secondly by the professional credentials that go with membership, post nominals, the ability to demonstrate easily the professional status. But by a country mile, CPD is the big one. So how do we help with that? Well, the digital age has made CPD a different proposition. So, IFE is international. So there are CPD events, using IFE as a context, that are taking place with our members, our branches internationally across the globe. Now they are then recorded and accessible through a CPD hub. So I think access to CPD and that's just one example. There are clearly other avenues that people can find and explore their CPD. Access and facilitation of CPD is far more open these days than it was even 5-10 years ago. There's much more accessibility there. Where we still have an issue is individual commitment to CPD and proper recording, and let's not just make a list of things we sort of did. Let's actually do the full thing about where's the reflective learning, what did that actually mean, how's that improved my practice. We randomly sample a percentage, as with all Engineering Council PEIs, of our registrants to seek that. And generally people are committed to CPD, but there is an issue, and I think it is a job for professional bodies like the IFE to continue pressing that we really want to increase the quality and the really meaningful sort of nature of CPD. It's not just a box ticking exercise.
It's definitely something that, when you mention quality, I mean, you don't want somebody going, I've submitted my 25 hours CPD and I've watched this one webinar on smoke control 50 times. It's making sure that it's actually demonstrable, and the way in which we focus on it and qualify is something that's quite topical. So just going back to competency culture, so we're using the term competency culture quite broadly, and like Kevin said earlier, it's difficult at the moment to define competence, and it's not something we necessarily want to do. But what do you think this means for the industry, and how are regulations and standards helping to develop this culture? Is this something that you could maybe give your input on, Carrie?
Yeah, so there's obviously been a lot of regulation changes since Grenfell, as covered in my little presentation. It's constantly moving forward. As I say, it's just evolving constantly. So obviously it's just making sure that people are staying up to date with the information as it comes out and feeding it down to the relevant people.
And Jacob as well, you also work very closely with companies to ensure their compliance. What would you, to put it delicately, what would you define competence at this point and at this stage in the industry?
That's not a terribly easy question to answer. I think the first thing is to agree with what Kevin and Carrie said earlier. There has to be an extension of what competency means from engineers, architects at the top, all the way down to the technicians at the bottom. Even carpenters, people fitting fire doors. That anyone involved in building a building ultimately has a part to play in fire safety. I think we've touched on a lot of them. For me, competence, integrity, and ethical practice, that all go hand in hand with each other. Without one of those three things, competence, it doesn't work. The ability to know the limits of your own knowledge and experience, and like Kevin said, knowing when to hold your hand up and ask that, I don't know what I'm doing, I need some help, or whatever that looks like. I'd say a big one for me is demonstrable experience. Sort of, to coin an old term, grandfather rights. There's a lot of people out there that know a lot. They're really good people, but don't necessarily have the qualifications. So how can we ensure that those people are still considered? And then finally, understanding of functional requirements and the application of performance objectives, not just applying the black and white written in a British standard somewhere, but having a fundamental understanding of why that is written, what it's trying to achieve, and then being able to actually have a conversation about, what it means and how someone can try and get to the objective place.
Well, thank you. And just to round off this panel discussion, I wanted to close with one final, probably quite difficult question. And we'll start with you, Jacob, as well. So in your opinion, do you think that the industry is doing enough to improve competency? And if not, do you think there's anything in particular that's holding us back?
The short answer for me, I think, is no. I don't think we're doing quite enough at the moment. I think we need to be sending more signals further down. I'm really big on technicians and people that are actually hands-on tools working. I think we need to be sending the kind of competency flag a lot further down the chain, and not just focusing at architects and engineers and those people in the design stages. It's got to be people that are actually doing the work as well. And
Steve, what are your thoughts?
Very, very simply, I think if I contrast the fire industry with other professional engineering institutions, with conversations with their chief execs and others, there's a nice little triangle that is visible in a lot of industries that is very shaky in the fire industry, and that's that relationship between individuals, employers, and professional bodies. There is some really, really positive examples of that within the fire industry, but I see a huge variation in those relationships. Those three relationships all have a place to play if we really want to get competency and professional standards nailed. There's some cracking examples of that in other more established disciplines. If you go into civil engineering, for example, the major employers, the professional body, and the individuals have a much stronger sort of three-way bond than perhaps is evident in most places in the fire industry.
Thank you. And Kevin, have you got anything to add?
Yep, quick answer. No, I don't think I don't think we are doing enough. The industry as a whole needs a strategic plan to make sure that we're including everyone, including the grandfather rights people, because that way, if you allow them to disappear out of the system, you're losing a lot of core competency, which could actually be used to drive forward the new young people coming into our industry and developing it further. So no, I don't think we're doing enough. And just to cover agree with what Jake said, people are doing a lot of really good stuff around competency in silos for their own organisations, and we're not sharing all that information and understanding effectively, I think.
Sadly, that is all we have time for today. But I do want to extend my appreciation to all four of you, Steve, Jacob, Carrie, Kevin. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this year's Fire by Live panel discussion. And I hope that we can continue this conversation as a whole industry after the event and improve life safety together. So thank you all for joining me.